Good afternoon, everyone, and I would like to extend my warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for attending our seminar on the Africa Peace Mission to Ukraine and Russia, which the Center for Mediation in Africa is co-hosting with the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. I am Dr. Sokfa John. I am the Deputy Director of the Center for Mediation in Africa. We are very excited to be engaging in a dialogue about this topic as it touches on a number of issues that are close to the heart of the CMA and that of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome our guests from everywhere, from DERCO. I know we have representatives from DERCO, from a number of embassies, UNISA. Thank you very much for coming. As a center, we seek to radically rethink mediation on the continent through African lenses or from African perspectives. This priority of ours means that we need to go beyond what the media portrays or what we find in mainstream academic literature. As we know, it is rare for even our own media platforms or academic institutions to really scrutinize things from African perspectives. This has certainly been the case with regard to the Africa Peace Mission to Russia and Ukraine, where it was declared a failure by some media platforms even before what the peace mission was actually all about and its intentions were properly understood. The purpose of this seminar, therefore, is to deeply unpack this in a meaningful way, with the intention of bringing nuance and understanding to the dynamics that are at play. Therefore, we see the seminar following four broad themes. The first of these is the question of motivation. Why the peace mission? What are its intentions, and what does it hope to achieve? The second theme is about geopolitics. What are the geopolitics of the situation? And where does Africa find itself in the midst of what has quickly become a global crisis? Thirdly, is in relation to Africa and South Africa's role. Are we biased? Are we neutral? And are we impartial? These are deemed critical in any peace mission, and particularly if such a mission were to become involved in mediation. But what do these really mean? And is South Africa any more or less biased than any other actor in the global arena? Fourthly, and finally, what is it that an African peace mission can offer? And I say this with emphasis on African. There has been talk about African approaches to peace and mediation, an emphasis on dialogue over power politics and so on. Is that at play here? And can it offer an alternative that could be useful in the current context? These are the four themes our panelists will be discussing and that we intend to discuss with all of you in the audience as well. After we've heard from the panel, we'll steer away from a typical Q&A and instead have a facilitated plenary discussion that will hopefully allow us to engage in meaningful dialogue that will lead to greater nuance and understanding. On our panel today, we are delighted to have Professor Tim Muriti, who is the head of Africa program, the head of program of Justice and Reconciliation in Africa at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. Tim has made immense contributions to the field of peace and mediation, both through his academic writing and practical work. We also have Professor Johansi van Wyk, a professor of international politics in the Department of Political Science at the University of South Africa. Professor van Wyk has published extensively in the area of South African foreign policy, diplomacy, and multilateralism. And we have, finally, Ms. Faith Mabera, a senior researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue. Ms. Mabera has done extensive work in the area of foreign policy analysis, regional and international peace and security issues, political and security risk analysis, and global governance. Welcome. Facilitating our panel today, as well as the plenary session to follow, is the director of the CMA, Professor Corey Vilenga, whose own research interest is in peace and mediation processes on the African continent, with a particular interest in the women, peace, and security agenda and the role of non-state actors. I believe today's conversation is going to be rich and dynamic. We look forward to hearing from our panelists, but also especially look forward to the plenary discussion in which every one of you in the room is invited to participate in bringing your own expertise, knowledge on the subject to bear to help us to understand the African peace mission with as much nuance and complexity as possible. Through this, we hope to develop a policy brief which will bring some new perspectives to the debate that has been circulating in the public domain to date. And before I hand over to Professor Corey, I want to thank the CMA team for everything they have done to make the event possible, and the IJR for partnering with us in this event. Please note, after the seminar, there's going to be some refreshments. Our team will direct you on where to find the refreshments. Thank you. And on that note, I would like to hand over to Professor Corey Vilenga.
Well, thanks very much, Sokfa, for that introduction and for framing the discussion that we're going to have today. I'm going to plunge right in, and so that we can get as much as we can out of our panelists. I just want to stress to our panelists that this is not a time for making speeches. I know especially academics they're used to standing in front of the lecture hall and talking at length. So I'm going to be keeping the pace nice and quick. And I also want to stress to everyone sitting in our audience that we are going to really want to engage in some meaty discussion during the plenary discussion. As Sokfa mentioned, we'll be doing that according to themes in the hope that we can take the discussion deeper. But do prepare yourself to get stuck in at that phase of the dialogue. Okay, so let's start right away with the question of, so why did South Africa and the other 5 African countries initiate this peace mission? What was behind this? What was the purpose, the motivation, the agenda? Who would like to speak to that first? Go ahead, Johansi.
Thank you so
and
much.
Sorry, I'm just going to use first names,
Yes,
right?
please.
Otherwise we're going to stumble over titles.
Thank you, Corey, and your team for inviting us. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. For me, if I look at the mission, for me, first of all, it is that there is a more and more acceptance, or at least an awareness by the continent, that the UN Security Council and the UN system is not working optimally, number one. Number two, I can easily see that it's a way for Africa, or at least these states that have been involved here, is to assert African agency. And then, of course, the issue of food security for the continent. I think that remains an issue. We are at least 30 million tons of grain short in Africa. It is now a case of winter is coming. Even though the Black Sea Grain Initiative has made some relief, we are still struggling for that. And then, of course, what we do not know is what is the personal interests that the various presidents have. What bothers me is that it is not an AU initiative per se. Let me stop here and then also hear from our colleagues. Thank you.
Corey, if I can piggyback off what Yuansi said, it's interesting, she mentions the notion of agency, and I think that's an important starting point. For me, the picture emerges a bit more clearly when you look at the backdrop of what is happening across the continent. There's almost a discernible shift in thinking. There's a shift for me in some of the foreign policy posture that we see a lot of countries taking in. And why do I say this? Take the cue, for instance, from developments in the Sahel. So there's been developments that have been framed in what some are calling the death of France-Afrique. For instance, in Africa, this pushback against long-term, long-drawn military presence, particularly by Western powers. So there was that pushback. I mean, we saw the most recent one of development is MINUSMA's demand by Malian authorities that MINUSMA be shut down actually quite urgently. That was an important take. And then prior to that, I mean, Burkina Faso, contention also there. Chad had this very serious diplomatic row with the German ambassador. That was, I think, around March or April, demanding that he exit. So that picture for me begins to paint a very, not only in terms of agency, so Africans, but African leaders coming to terms with the geostrategic value that they will, and perhaps beginning to have a sense of appreciation just how sophisticated the geopolitical game is and the kind of trade-offs that they need to make in foreign policy in order to show up a lot of their strategic interests. So that's one dimension of it. And ultimately, it's the externalities of the Russia-Ukraine war. The fact that apart from the war being heavily mediatized, the war also, because we live in such an interdependent world order, the ripple effects, of course, being felt on the continent macroeconomically speaking. What she talked about, dependence on not only disruption to the price shocks, but the dependence on wheat import cereal. I mean, Russia and Ukraine account for over 50% of wheat imports from the continent, and particularly the most hard hit were the North African countries, your Egypt, Libya, Sudan. The impact of that price shock certainly for me also acted as a key determinant in pushing for Africa's involvement. If I may just quickly, I just want to point out something, because I know we are also going to get into the theme of the broader mediation process, and this is something I also would appreciate my fellow panelists also chiming in on. It's important to, let's not also romanticize the African approach. And I want to draw on that point, because prior to the African initiative, there was also a number of proposals that were put on the table that were turned down for various reasons. And I know, Corey, you'll get to that, the question of timing, etc. Prior to the African one, there was the Chinese 12-point proposal that was shunned rather quickly, just the moment it hit the table. We saw interesting comments by Brazilian President Lula. He was calling for the establishment of a group of countries that he put forward that perhaps could begin talking to peace. And then this is when we saw now the entry of the African initiative. And interestingly, just about 2 weeks ago, there was also a meeting in Copenhagen by a group of G7 countries, some EU countries. South Africa was also there to begin to also build on a proposal that had been put forward by Zelensky himself. So those are just some of the dynamics that are happening on the momentum for getting to the negotiating table. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much.
If I could also chime in, I think we shouldn't forget South Africa actually has a legacy of peacemaking and peace building. This is the home of Mandela, the late Mandela. So from a purely peacemaking, mediation, third-party intervention perspective, there is a reason for African leaders to be interested in addressing the crisis in Ukraine. To be very clear, the Ukraine has a right to fight for its freedom. African countries actually know about this more than most, I would say, given our long struggles with colonialism on this continent. So for me, we should not discount the purely human relational dimension of wanting, in fact, to see peace in that very troubled country. And Cyril Ramaphosa himself is a seasoned negotiator from the Codesa talks. He's intervened in a number of crises across the African continent. Very much, this is something that's being driven from his office. You can see that. And also, we shouldn't forget, like in March last year, he even intimated that he might have a role in mediation, following a phone call with Vladimir Putin. At that stage, he was really rubbished and told, don't even think about it. Lots of pieces came out saying he can't even sort out load shedding. What's he going to do to try to address the crisis in Ukraine? So I think it's very important to also put the framework of peacemaking on this intervention. That it really is a first step. There's a lot more to be done. This really wasn't even scratching the surface. I think from a peacemaking perspective, relationship building, which is clearly a huge task going ahead, given the diametrically opposed positions of Ukraine and Russia, and also opening lines of communication more effectively. I think that's always a positive thing. And maybe I can just throw in a bit of the salacious and say that the Lady R drama of the weapons being transferred onto the so-called Russian ship, we don't have evidence yet. I haven't seen any evidence. If the ambassador of the US has evidence he would like to share with us, it would be great. But what's happened is the story has shifted. That issue has moved slightly to the background. It might come back again. So I'm not saying there was a Machiavellian agenda, but that's one of the side effects, if you will, of this intervention. Corey.
Thank you. Yeah. So let me first pick up. I like that what you say, Tim, about sort of the relational aspect and our legacy of peacemaking, because I think we often have this kind of realist sort of interpretation of everything, that there's always a self-interest and there's always these agendas, but to actually look at it from that perspective. But obviously, the importance of African agency, and I found it interesting what you're saying, Faith, that almost kind of a growth on the continent in terms of understanding the sophisticated geopolitics and our position in that, and taking agency in that. And then, of course, the food security issue can't be ignored. Nobody mentioned the upcoming BRICS summit. Does anyone want to say just a few sentences on that? Do you think that's in play here?
Yes, you threatened to cut us off abruptly, so I thought we were eventually going to get into that. But in Kiev, President Ramaphosa actually stated that he was going to speak to Vladimir Putin about this. We're not sure what the conversation was about, whether asking him not to come or looking for some kind of a solution. But I definitely think it was an item on the agenda. Unfortunately, we don't have that much information coming out of the St. Petersburg meeting as we would like, but I think that was definitely on the agenda.
Can I please add something? Remember that it is also not only the BRICS meeting that is in August, but also the Russia-Africa meeting that is before us. And of course, bilateral relations continue. So we must be mindful of that. Then the third aspect is Putin is still wanted by the ICC. So South Africa that's perhaps one suggestion, that South Africa thought, okay, so let's get the heat off us hosting him by initiating this peace. So at least there is, if the Kremlin is eager to go for a peace, a mediation type of event, then the world may be softer on that. So I think that is important that we take that into account also. If I may just link up with what Faith said, what was interesting for me in terms of the peace plans on the table, Indonesia also came to the party and put a very controversial, some would say, plan on the table. Mexico also put something on the table. Besides, of course, Zelensky's own proposals, and of course the Russian one, give us what we want. So we also see a global South response to that. And President Ramaphosa specifically also mentioned, this is aligned with the non-aligned movement. So the initiatives that we took, so very much making this, even though it's not endorsed officially by any of these organizations, but positioning it very much, very clever use of rhetoric by saying that, we're all in it together, so you can't fault us on this.
That's important to keep in mind. Thank you, Johansi. And I think this movement from the global south is something that we need to consider very carefully and understand more deeply. So what is the support of the international community been? Who is supporting this? Who is funding it? I've heard rumors that it's a French agriculturalist who has interest in fertilizer. Has that been verified? What do you know about who is in fact supporting this Africa Peace Mission?
The peace mission, you mean?
Yes.
I don't know I don't have the inside track on, like you're saying, all that additional information about, financial backers per se. For me, coming from here, from a foreign policy analyst perspective, of course, such initiatives, you need to have some particular leverage, it needs. But I think the pressure came, in one sense, it's optics that the African leaders were playing at, assertion, particularly in times of crisis. And if you look at if you look at happenings on the continent, I just want to be very specific here so that I don't get lost in translation. There's certain push factors that foreign policy actors need sort of leverage on, not only to build on their political capital, but there's a particular messaging that they need to present to their audiences abroad and within. Why I'm saying this is perhaps, so a lot of African countries, apart from the effects and the negative effects and the ripple effects that their own people were feeling, a lot of it also stems from, I want to say, this need to assert agency, assert leadership, almost a politics of distraction, if you will, take to avert our gaze from what's happening, the crisis domestically. That's one angling that can be used. But also increasingly, when you look, I've talked about the geostrategic profile of Africa changing rather immensely, but I think it's also the quest for structural power, this idea that in an evolving global order where power is shifting, the structures have tended to remain, they're rather sort of strongly hoisted on the ground, but there's forces that need for that to change. And I think Africa is using the tools that it has in its hands to actually effect some of the change, to get its voice heard on the ground. Because once you get your foot on the ground, you're able to, on the door, you're able to, open up conversations. But coming back to this broader theme of mediation, I think an important thing that sometimes gets lost when you talk about mediation efforts is that there's a violence negotiation nexus. So rather than looking at mediation as something happening in the context of peace per se, we need to look at it, or in the context, for instance, of a ceasefire. Mediation sometimes happens when there's even ongoing violence on the ground, but the timing of it is important. And this idea of getting the parties to shift their concessional points, to shift their posture towards concession making, I think is what the African leaders were counting on. Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
I'm going to stop you because I don't want to go too much into the mediation side of things, but absolutely, okay. But so I hear what you're saying about optics and distraction, structural power. Who do you think was supporting from the international community?
But I think let's first start with South Africa, because I think South Africa definitely footed the bill for part of this trip, for sure, because there was the South African Airways chartered flight. I think we remember the debacle in Poland, where apparently the papers were not in the right manner to allow the security personnel and the media to travel on to St. Petersburg, to Kiev, sorry. So I think you have to say that South Africa has definitely put an aspect of this bill. Whether you're hinting at some kind of nefarious, surreptitious bankroller who's linked to international criminal networks, that's a fascinating question. I don't have the answer to that particular question.
Your answer seems to.
And I wouldn't want to frame this peace mission in that light at all. I think you have to acknowledge South African taxpayers' money has been used to enable this trip.
Thanks, Tim, for that.
We must remember that there were 3 planes from South Africa. In Kwazi, the president's jet, the one that the media contingent on, that framed sort of the message on board, streamed that, and then the 3rd plane. And nobody seems to be talking about the 3rd plane because there was no media there. 120 security officials, how many tons of hardware that we don't know what has been on that. Never mind that. You were asking, is there a bankroller? We don't know. We have heard of the French businessman of the Brazzaville Foundation, Olivier, being mentioned. In South Africa, the head of Paramount has been, and I forgot his name now, Ichikovitz, is it Ivor? Yeah, of the Paramount Group, but you may recall that there had been distancing from him and the group that they were involved. So at least on the chartering, apparently it's 16 million rand per A340 to have that chartered. So and it took longer than I suppose what it meant. But then also the cost of, remember that the mission stayed longer in Moscow. It went on a lovely evening boat cruise with Putin. So we must also talk about impartiality. We know that Zelensky could not, for example, extend the same hospitality. It is a war zone, but also in terms of optics. A night in St. Petersburg, on a boat trip, a cruise, we don't know what deals have been made on that. Let's get to that later.
Yes, we'll get to the impartiality. Thank you, Ansi, though, for flagging it. So I hear you. So there's the possibility of other support in the background, but Tim is emphasizing it was South African taxpayers' money that paid for this. And again, it's that theme of South Africa positioning itself as a peacemaker due to its legacy. So let's analyze the peace mission a little bit. And I just want to stress that at this point, it was a fact-finding mission as far as we know, right? And not a mediation mission at all. It's a fact-finding mission. How would you assess or analyze the success of this initial peace mission? And it's hard to say because we don't really know what happened. But
sure, the word success could be a bit misleading. I think the word impactful was used by both Cyril Ramaphosa and Naledi Pandor. Success will ultimately only be measured by the outcomes. This was not only fact-finding, but also a listening mission. There was lots of listening, but there was also proposals. There was a 10-point plan that was put on the table, which it looks like both sides did not vehemently disagree with the 10-point plan. So in terms of mediation, the process of mediation, relationship building between the third party and the belligerent parties is absolutely crucial. And so if we put it in that context, then this was an impactful mission. But as I said, a lot more needs to be mapped out and framed in terms of the way forward. In terms of what they intended to achieve, I think they achieved what they intended to achieve, which was to listen, to also put their proposals on the table, and to interact with both leaders. And that's something that the African Peace Mission has actually said is significant. It's the first mission that has interacted with both leaders in that short space of about 2-3 days, almost opening a direct line of communication. What comes beyond that, I think we'll get into towards the end of this conversation. But I think that was a very important, first step.
Thanks for that, Tim. Go ahead.
For me, it is but too soon to tell, but it had been very influential in the sense that there was a lot of attention on it. From the Kremlin side, it was said that it's a showing that the West plans are not working, and here is Africa that stands outside. This NATO, US, EU triangle is making an effort. We must also remember that it has brought a lot of kudos to South Africa. Our president is a bit shaky where he is, 6 to 8 months in the seat, so he desperately needed something that elevates his standing, and surely this has, and it's almost like a Ramaphosa of the early 1990s, being somebody that can broker a peace. Another reason why I think it is also significant, I think we should perhaps frame it as the significance also, is the fact that it is outside the AU, and one could ask a question, why does the AU not get involved? But at least 3 AU chairpersons were involved. The current one, previous one, Macky Sall, and of course Ramaphosa was involved, and of course then a number of other countries and leaders who could not attend. The question remains is, if these leaders cannot solve the questions on the continent, why do they want to address somebody else's issue? And this is where we need to ask serious questions. Is it deflection? Is it cooperation? Is it part of this growing assertiveness that we may see? And of course, is this perhaps something that has received the blessing of Putin? We know that he's a master strategic thinker. And yeah, is it also an initiative that is sort of a prologue to what will happen with BRICS, growth alternative to the existing order? Let me stop there for the moment.
Yeah, and I find it very interesting. I mean, what you were saying is quite different from what I was picking up in the media. There was quite a lot of reporting about how the whole mission had failed, and I wondered what that was based on, because, as you say, Tim, that the intended outcomes were perhaps achieved. Simply listening, putting the proposal on the table, the first steps of relationship building, all the other things we've talked about, the optics, the distraction, the structural power, the agency. There's so many things that were achieved that were perhaps to the benefit of the actors in question.
Yeah, there was a lot of criticism around the timing, because apparently it was bang in the middle of a Ukrainian offensive that was supposed to lead to territorial gains. Now, I think most analysts, military analysts, have actually conceded that the territorial gains have not been have not manifested on the ground. For me, this conflict is very much at a standoff phase. The Ukrainians using artificial intelligence, drone technology, the Skylink internet system means that they actually have the ability to hold off the Russians. And therefore, I don't see the Ukrainians losing this war. And I clearly don't see the Russians winning it. Okay, so if that is the reality, and there's pressure on European countries and North America to send more weapons, cluster munitions, jet fighters. It's going to get worse. Ukraine now wants to join NATO. Clearly, this is a spiral downwards. And unless you arrest that trend, trajectory, this war is actually going to become much greater conflagration, than what we have at the moment.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Faith.
Something that Tim said also raised an initial. For me, the image of a delegation of African heads of states going to a war zone and being awarded that afforded audience and everything was interesting, but it brought to me, it made me reminiscent of what happened in the lead up to the NATO intervention in Libya in 2011, where we also had a similar a delegation of heads of states, but they didn't actually get to go and meet Gaddafi. Their mission was waylaid before they had a chance to meet with him and perhaps deal with the issues on the table. And I think, just getting back to the question of this particular, whether you want to call it a peace mission, whether you want to call it an initiative in the sense that it was initiating a particular, laying the groundwork for what would then be ostensibly a peace mission. What was interesting about the outcome was the moment, so a lot of news and attention was made of the fact that the kind of revelation that Putin then made to the African leaders, talking about the derailment of the Istanbul peace process, and how just at the onset of the war in March 2022, they'd actually managed to get to some formula of some sort in talks with the Ukrainians. But then we had then PM Johnson of the UK, at that time was visiting Kiev, and it was almost as if he'd gone to give marching orders to Zelensky that, no, we will back you up with whatever weaponry you need, just continue with the war. So that was an interesting take for me from the messaging that Putin put across, because it points to what essentially every mediator has to contend with, which is not only the relationship of past conflict with the parties involved, but also the timing issue, and also how to breach the trust deficit that we've had. Yeah.
Corey, for me, the clear winner of this visit was South Africa, President Ramaphosa. He has clearly shown that he is a political broker on the continent. He's been the chairperson of the African Union. But look at how many visits he has entertained, how many calls have been made, how many people have stopped in Pretoria, have had a discussion. The Germans were here, other African countries were here, foreign ministers were here. And it was also a sort of a natural progression to some extent of South Africa staying out of, abstaining from votes, but constantly saying we want international law to be the benchmark, the parties to the conflict must do it, but also there was another element in the sense that the narrative has also changed. So for South Africa, there's been some maturity in its approach, from abstention to initially saying we are willing to participate in peace, having the call with Zelensky, and then now getting a team, so to speak. For me, it's been good that our president had said that it's a war, so the narrative has shifted clearly from a conflict and intervention by Russia, etc. So at least we see that there is a meeting of minds on a global level also. And then the other issue is that it may also generate some renewed energy into some African peace processes. That there is a need, if we go to Europe, clearly we must put some effort more in back home.
Okay, so interesting spin-off that I didn't think about at all. So thank you for those interventions. And interesting that the South African narrative has changed. I mean, you're speaking about the narrative within South Africa, which is significant. So we have been discussing this. The next question is on the geopolitical considerations, and of course that has come into play. Is there more that we want to say on unpacking that? I'm curious about, Jansi, you've brought this up twice, the AU not formally getting involved, that this was, what the reasons for that might have been. Any comments on the geopolitics?
Yeah, on the AU issue, though, I think let's unpack it a little bit. I don't think you would see the African Union as an organization formally getting involved. AU actually has its hands full, believe it or not. Sudan just comes to mind. The list is very long, about 20 conflicts on this the continent that they're dealing with. So they certainly doesn't want to overextend themselves to. So what you see is a model that African leaders have used time and time again, which is a group of eminent people, personnel, distinguished heads of state. In fact, the Ethiopian agreement that was signed in November last year was mediated by two former heads of state, Uhuru Kenyatta, Obasanjo of Nigeria, and former deputy president of South Africa, Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, right? So this is the model that you actually see operating quite frequently on the African continent. And I think that would be the model that was utilized in this particular case. the fact that you have the current sitting chairperson of the AU Assembly of Heads of State and Government, in fact, is an African Union representation. Not a formally stated one, but it is very much an African Union representation. Why would you choose the president of Comoros? Because he is the current chair of the AU Assembly of Heads of State. Macky Sall was a former chair. South Africa has been on the Peace and Security Council. Hakainde Chilema of Zambia was formerly heading up the SADC organ for political affairs, peace and security. So I think we need to nuance and unpack this a little bit more. On the geopolitics, I think it's very important that Faith raised the issue of Libya, where in fact it was Jacob Zuma that was one of the former heads of state that went to try to mediate with Gaddafi. But the NATO countries, US, UK, France, in fact, launched the bombardment process even before the mediation, the intervention could take place. And I think for me, it's significant that was big major powers acting on their own volition. Yes, you could have a quibble about the UN Security Council resolution 1973 and what it meant, but I think most analysts have come to the conclusion this was an action that didn't need to take, the military action in Libya didn't need to take place at the time that it did, obviously led to the killing of Gaddafi. But for me, what is symptomatic of that is the fact that major powers, and I would say the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, US, UK, France, China, Russia, still behave as though there is no international rules-based order. So when we hear this refrain, we must restore the international rules-based order. You've got 5 countries here that systematically ignore the international rules-based order. So from an African perspective, I would say that international rules-based order is a 2-tier system. And from our perspective, we'd even question whether it really exists if certain powerful countries have the ability to act at their own whim.
Anyone want to add to what Tim is saying?
Yeah, I think it is also a point of commonality that the African group has with Ukraine. You may recall that middle of 2022, Zelensky also made the same call. He said that the international system is clearly not working. In fact, he said, I'm willing to invite all leaders to Kiev so that we can have an alternative almost. And you may recall that he gave quite an extensive sort of shopping list of what could be done. I think it was about July 2022. And from that statement of his, I think there is a lot to lay groundwork for. But we must be mindful as Africans that, you know, this is a different kind of war, in the sense that it's a major post-Cold War conflict in Europe. We are heavily dependent on food sources. We must be mindful that NATO and EU, there are historical tensions with Russia, the Soviet Union. It's a very complex situation, as most conflicts are. So for us in Africa, the geopolitical is, of course, is that the more these countries invest into weapons or what, there is also the effect of donor money that is becoming scarcer. And we are mindful of that. If we want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, there will be no more money. And we can already see that Europe is diverting a lot of funding to the reconstruction and development of Ukraine. Less commitments will be made to the continent. So the one thing, and then the second one is, of course, the Wagner Group. We are not sure where exactly is Wagner going. Wagner will not disappear. It will stay a factor on the continent. It has deep economic interest here, also for Russian oligarchs. It will remains very, very strong, I think. And of course, we must be mindful. Another geopolitical aspect is the future of Putin. If you read reports, some say Putin is weaker than he was before. If he's weaker, he will become more strong-handed. If he is stronger, then he's likely to stay on. Then the dynamics of any peace process must take that into account. And as I said earlier, you know, it is also a wake-up call for the international community. In 2015, when the Crimea was invaded, what has changed since 2015? And why were the responses not similar to what has happened then? Why has Ukraine suddenly become so important? And one can go into all kinds of conspiracy theories, obviously. But yeah, the geopolitical impact is very much also part of the rise of China, or the perceived rise of China, and then also the rivalries that the US and China may have. And China remains a very important factor to consider in all of these changes.
I guess it's all speaking to this changing global order that I think is very threatening to a number of, or to the global society, I guess. And so let's move away from all of that and get into the mediation side of things. Obviously, as a centre, this is very interesting to us. So we know this was not necessarily a mediation intervention. Perhaps it was the beginnings of a mediation intervention. Perhaps it was a fact-finding mission. Do you think, if we had to think about South Africa, or the South Africa +5, if we can call it that, mediating in this conflict, does South Africa, is there any possibility for that? Is South Africa biased? Is it too biased? Has it kind of shot itself in the foot in terms of becoming a mediator in the situation? What are your thoughts on that?
If I may, Corey. The mediation question is interesting because when you approach a particular context and you come in as a mediator, there are particular factors that influence your strategy. And apart from the contextual issues, which is the bigger question about timing, which we've alluded to, the question of ripeness, and whether the conflict parties had gotten to a mutually hurting stalemate, I think that right from at that particular moment, it was self-evident that it was not, at that particular point. So I don't want to dwell too much on that. The question of strategy of a mediator and the factors that influence in any mediation outcome, I think, are the ones that are important. And why do I say that? There are certain aspects that will influence any mediation strategy. The intensity of the conflict, whereas high-intensity conflicts primarily or ordinarily necessitate higher level mediation parties or mediation actors. So it's questionable to the extent to which, for instance, for me at least, an African peace mission, if they have the kind of leverage that a power mediator would have, just in terms of incentivizing a lot of the conflict parties to shift their posture. That was a question for me that was important. And secondly, it was also, intensity is important, but also there's a very, so the incompatibility of positions that we see now is arising from the fact that, yes, we are not at a mutually hurting stalemate, and two, we've talked about the history of the trust deficit that goes back decades. I mean, I don't want to go into the history of the Maidan uprising, the non-implementation of the Minsk agreements, but also the fact that both of the conflict parties have maintained their hardline stances. On one hand, you have Russia saying it's still sticking to the goals of its special military operation. On the other hand, you have Ukraine almost using the NATO card as leverage, bargaining chip, and two, there's the unresolved question about the Crimea, and as we talk about now, the dynamics of the conflict are such that latest that I checked, Russia is occupying, if you count the Donetsk region, Donbas region, they're occupying about 17% of Russian territory if you include Crimea. So those are some of the key factors, I'd say, the flashpoints that would become really hot button issues in any mediation attempts. The choice of a strategy also comes to whether for such a high level conflict, why I'm talking about the strategy is important, because in one hand, the African one, for me, if it was successful, hypothetically, it would mostly be around a facilitative, communicative role, whereas an argument can be made that what's needed is a power broker, a power mediator in this case, and this is where questions of impartiality and neutrality become a key. So those are, I think, the kind of moving parts we need to really look at when you're looking at the, and here I'm going to use a careful word, not success, but progress of a mediation element, because you measure progress by the ability of a mediator to actually get the conflict parties to shift from a zero-sum approach to one more that's more positive. So shifting their stances towards and aligning along that zone of incompatibility, I think. And that's where the trick is. Even as we speak now, actually, I'm sure you've seen the news, the Vilnius NATO summit is ongoing. And top of the agenda, of course, is the question of whether Ukraine will be the 31st member of, the 32nd member of NATO, and also the Sweden question. But it's interesting because for me, it won't, yes, Zelensky is using it as a bargaining chip, but I don't think we need to make a bigger deal of it than it is. I think what will come is Zelensky wants Israel-like security arrangements. So essentially, NATO guarantees, but without full NATO membership. That's what he's pressing for. And I think, I don't know whether he'll get it. It's casting doubt on just the kind of unity that NATO has institutionally.
Thanks, Faith.
Maybe, Corey, if I can throw in some mediation theory, since we are at the Center for Mediation. I think we have at least three categories, there are probably more, of mediators. There's the power mediator, who actually has some leverage, typically over one, perhaps even both actors. Think United States, Israel, Palestine conflict. Historically, United States, Israel, Egypt, and the Sinai demilitarized zone. Then you have the procedural mediator. Often you find in professional settings, in the office space, they have certain procedures they follow and they achieve a mediation outcome. And the social mediator, who you often find in social settings, families and so on and so forth. So the huge critique of the African peace mission is that Africans have absolutely no leverage whatsoever over Vladimir Putin or Zelensky. And that might be true, but they do have the social links that they're establishing. They have a moral leverage, especially South Africa, by the way, given its history of apartheid and its transition. Yes, 30 years, we have a lot of quibbles and so on. But that is something that South Africa and the other African actors bring to the table. And also, let's not forget, we actually have conflicts on the African continent that have been addressed through mediation processes. South Sudan, DRC, Congo, I mentioned Ethiopia, we have Sierra Leone. We have quite a number of conflicts on the African continent that have been addressed through mediation and third-party intervention. So actually, we don't lack experience. Even when it comes to understanding the mindset of the strongman personality, we have them on the African continent. If you want to understand the psychology of, people who bomb and destroy their countries, like the two generals in Sudan right now, we have them on the African continent. So if anything, Africa should be consulted and engaged in this process, because we can bring perspectives that, say, Europe hasn't had to deal with for quite a while, and North America.
Right. For me, it's, there's a simple solution to this: Russia must withdraw. That sounds very simple as it is. So that's the realist in me thinking, not going into 10-point or 12-point peace plans, but simply get Russia out of the country. Now, Russia, as a revisionist and a historical interpretation of where they are, we've seen Putin numerous times on that. There is also the narrative of the Slavic Brotherhood that they want to restore, etc. We know those arguments. But all of the plans put on the table so far refers to the sovereignty of Ukraine as it is. And whether it's the Minsk agreement that should be honored or some other agreement, Russia took a long time, almost 30 years, before it lays claim to this 25 years, etc. So for Africans to come in and try a mediation process, I'm very skeptical of that. Our leverage clearly, as you say, is we do have aspects of leverage, but can we capitalize on it? My suspicion would be is that when we reach this mutually hurting stalemate, it can obviously either a referendum or a withdrawal or a ceasefire or the Indonesian example or a proposal of a demilitarized zone. The fact is, sadly, is that not enough destruction has taken place. Both sides are still too strong-willed and have still too much to give rather than to lose. And as long as NATO and Europe and the Americans are throwing weapons, remember that an unintended consequence is the modernization of the Ukrainian army, becoming fully integrated into the Western way of thinking, military strategy, etc. And then also, the real breakthrough can come when it is an actor or group of actors that have something to offer. Post-conflict reconstruction in the case of Ukraine, one that can get Russia out, one that can get perhaps also a safe exit, because we must be mindful, what if Zelensky is out of power today? That will change the dynamics. The African leaders that are part of this are, Ramaphosa is going to election, Ichilema is halfway through his Comoros, and their leadership of the African Union is end of the year, isn't it? So there are also dynamics within the African groups that will affect that in the long run.
Right, so I would like to come back to this whole issue of power leverage and the social mediator and so on. But before I do, no one's actually spoken about South Africa as being biased or neutral or impartial, although the media seems to be quite fixated on this issue. Does it feel like a non-issue
Well, I don't think it's been dealt with from a position of knowledge and insight. I think it's emotional responses. Perhaps certain media houses have a certain agenda. So from the very outset, South Africa adopted a non-aligned position. We can say we don't really know what non-alignment means. In 2023, there was a previous non-aligned movement. And is this the revival of it? But let's break down the numbers. China is South Africa's largest trading partner, followed by the European Union, and third is the United States of America, about $21 billion a year. So it is in South Africa's interest to also engage all parties. I can't, from that perspective, see how South Africa can be biased. If anything, it's actually trying to hold a middle ground in a very, very emotive conflict with the European Union that is very, very clear that where everybody should stand. Because, in fact, the European Union has a political association agreement with Ukraine. So, in fact, the European Union is all in on Ukraine. All the chips are in. Ukraine has to make it through. There's no way out. So there's a tendency to want to drag in all the other countries into this confluence, right? And I think if you divide the entire world into either you're with us or against us, who in the end is actually going to hold the middle ground and develop a pathway for peace? It's not going to be the Africans by themselves, and I think we'll talk about that later. A contact group model of the Chinese initiative, the Turkish initiative, Brazilian, now we had Indonesian, Mexican, plus the African. We have to create a kind of a spiderweb model, a contact group formation that will work collectively on this initiative. There is not going to be a single mediator for this crisis. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I can put that on the table, and I can even cash in some chips on that particular issue. There will not be a single mediator for this crisis. It'll have to be a collective group of actors working together, right? So I think we should actually steer away from this attempt to try to push South Africa one way or the other. I think that's actually very unproductive. Also, in the 30-year history of the independence and democracy of South Africa has never fought a physical war against another country. Yes, intervention in Lesotho, SADC, dubious issues around that, we can unpack that, but it's never physically declared war against another country. Right. And that's very important, I think.
Right. It again speaks to sort of the moral high ground that South Africa potentially has in this. So let's move on to that question then. We talked about sort of power mediation and the leverage and that kind of thing, and power being a power broker versus a kind of a more moral, social mediator. And this question of an African approach, and I think Ramaphosa actually used it in his rhetoric as well. He talked about coming with an African approach. Do you think, and now you're talking about a global south approach, perhaps, of the non-aligned movement. Is there an African approach to mediation or African approaches? Does the South African white paper on Ubuntu come in here? Pan-African approaches, perhaps, we can speak about. Can you speak to that a little bit? What is this African approach? Is that idealizing this a little bit too much?
I think Tim alluded to it earlier when he talked about the tendency and the pattern that has emerged is that whenever there's a conflict, you see us sort of defaulting to, we get statesmen, maybe retired or in office, and we get them together and we say they should have the particular leverage to actually go and attend to a particular conflict. So that's been replicated just on face value. That's what we've seen. As to whether there's an African model, I think that's an interesting question. I wouldn't be very quick to put a label on it just because of the kind of the kind of point we find ourselves in geopolitically. And I wouldn't be so quick to dismiss the geopolitical significance of this war. Not only has it prompted a rethinking of the European security order. Just look at the kind of sea change in policy that Germany had to undergo, ramping up its defense budget. That's a major thing when you think about it from not only a national security standpoint, but from foreign policy perspective. So the European security order was a question. In one sense, it was also important because of the NATO, it sort of galvanized NATO again into question. And it raises the very interesting question about whether NATO is moving away from its so-called defensive posture and rationale into a more offensive stance. So, and it boils right down, why I'm bringing the NATO question is because that's the meat of the matter in a way. The question of NATO's eastward expansion is one of the major hot button issues in this conflict. And as I said, it's interesting that the summit is going on now. And any mediator would have to navigate those issues particularly, and hence the question about a power broker. But I don't think the African approach for me is unique in the sense that when you look at all these other proposals, peace points that were put on the table, the African one was unique in the sense that, at least from what I could see, they're the only ones who engaged or were willing to actually have an ear open to hear the concerns of those parties without necessarily imposing a particular directive. So that was the unique point.
Which is significant.
It is. Yeah.
I don't think we can talk about a African approach. I think we can talk about African approaches.
Mm-hmm.
And to echo Faith, the high-level former heads of state model has been utilized, is still being utilized to this day, just a few weeks ago. So I would say, yes, that is one model where you have the high-level former head of state. The problem always is that the former head of state is not necessarily a mediator, is not necessarily trained in mediation, has not been to CMA to get a briefing on how to do mediation properly, right? And so sometimes they're political actors in a space working their way through. Good news is Cyril actually knows a thing or two about peacemaking. So yes, that is definitely one type of intervention that we utilize. The huge criticism that always comes from civil society and academia is that that high-level process never connects with the people. And ultimately, this is all about the people. It is all about the people. It's not really about the leaders. And that's been a big challenge for us. And that some of the work that we're trying to do now is to find how to link that high-level mediation with the communal, the grassroots, the societal mediation processes, and even indigenous cultural processes that we have on the continent. So I think it gives a lot of food for thought. If there are any master's students out there who are looking for a good question to address. This has been a fascinating one. I would like to read your dissertation at the end, and Corey will supervise it, I hope.
Corey, I think the idea of a high-level panel in Africa, we've seen the use of the African Union Panel of the Wise. Each regional organization has a group of elders. So that is sort of let's call it a typical approach that has been, because it's enshrined in protocols, etc., and the African Union Constitutive Act, for example. So that is one approach that is endorsed by the African Union and, of course, regional organizations. One other role, or actor at least, is the Secretary General of the UN, who technically, in terms of the Charter, which enjoys the UN with its universal membership, ideally he should play a role, but he's too much connected with what has been the very case made by Zelensky and by Putin, that it's clearly not working. The Security Council will definitely not solve this problem. So I think it will be a good exercise to start eliminating what will not work. We've seen in the past heads of states like Marty Ahtisaari, Olof Palme, being involved, Julius Nyerere, being involved in peace processes. That could be one of the models, is that a former head of state, for example, can take the role. But the issue is also, and I think here Russia has perhaps miscalculated. It has lost a grip, or at least social influence to some extent, of the former Soviet Union states. The European Union was very fast to get those states into its sphere of influence. Russia has lost that. I think another approach could also is to talk to Russia's allies, to start off softening an approach. I like this idea of a network of actors that there are one voice or one message coming from different corners. But I think we are a long way before we will get to mediation. There are too many voices at the moment. Zelensky is hell-bent on standing his ground, so is Putin. So I think that we will have to focus perhaps on the humanitarian side, on the Russian side, of course, and on the Ukrainian side. And here it may be good to focus on the International Red Crescent Society, Red Cross Society, is to get the humanitarian situation settled, at least sorted out, and to make it unattractive for military to move, so that at least there is that kind of.
Can I disagree with
very shortly, yes, because we need to wrap up the panel.
I think there's also an understated element here. Yes, the more visible options are the high level, the heads of state, but there's a role to be played by your military and diplomatic back channels. I mean, this is what we saw in diffusing tensions in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the role that military back channels play. And some would argue that there's been a disconnect between, for instance, the security departments of the collective West with Russia, that there's been a severing of ties. Yes, that might be true on face value, but that doesn't discount the role that the very high-ranking military officials can play in sort of establishing a hotline to the generals, particularly because of the fluidity of the front lines. That is something that a track 2 diplomacy would also play in anchoring then and allowing and opening the door for your high-level engagement. So for me, that is where I see a window in terms of the military back channels.
I love that. I can see Tim really wants to speak to that very quickly.
No, just, I mean, speaking about former heads of state, I think it's important to note that Cyril Ramaphosa might soon be a former head of state. If the conflict is still going on,
right.
He might be in prime position to be the one who's the focal point. But I think I just want to put on the table the contact group model, mediation, that has been used in some crises. In the Middle East in particular, you had a number of countries with interests who form part of a contact group. And you could have the core group at the middle that has some direct interest in the conflict, an outer circle
Right.
that has secondary interests or is affected in some way, even further out concentric circles operating in unison. But the focal point has to coordinate this. If you create too many forums, or you have Putin and Zelensky going to where they're going to get the best deal, where they feel people are aligned with what they're saying.
Right.
And that is direct experience from the African continent.
Right.
I can give you the example of Darfur, the Sudan conflict in Darfur, where there were 15 special envoys from different parts of the world. 15 special envoys. And the United Nations African Union mediator had to actually try to bring them all together in
Right.
some group.
Yeah.
So I think that will be the model going forward for Ukraine.
Okay, we were at the ending points of this panel discussion, just in case the audience is getting fatigued here. But I think needs to be a bit of a shift from, there's quite a simplistic idea of mediation as being, a mediator between two conflicting parties at this very high level, using kind of power brokerage or leverage and so on to fight towards an agreement as quickly as possible. I think we need to think about mediation in much more complex ways, happening at all these different tracks. And we haven't even talked about track 3 mediation and what that could be doing, if we could be working with civil society organizations and all sorts of other networks at a much lower level that could really start shifting things as well. A track 2 level, as Faith mentioned, I think there's a lot going on there that we might not even be aware of. And there's so much, and so when people were looking at the African Peace Mission through this lens of South Africa being this mediator at the highest level at track 1 and brokering an agreement, that was perhaps, and then it was dismissed as being absurd. I mean, I spoke to some people in the field who kind of laughed at this idea, but I think if you understand mediation in a far more complex way, is a lot of things happening at the same time. And I think the complexity that this conversation has brought us in terms of what the African position is and what the African agenda is in all of this helps us to understand some of that complexity. And I think one of the things, we've been in conversation with the mediation organizations across the globe about the situation and, where are they positioning themselves? And a lot of the thinking is around not about mediating the conflict, but what happens after. How are we going to do the decades-long repair? And who is going to be doing that? And a lot of mediation and peace organizations are already working very hard to think ahead of what they're going to be doing to heal the rifts, not only between Ukraine and Russia, but across Europe and globally. I think there's going to have to be a lot of repair and trust building and so on. So I think there's a lot to think about beyond this sort of narrow idea of what mediation really is. One final question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. What does this historical intervention by African countries in Europe represent for you personally? What did it evoke for you when you read about the Africa Peace Mission? Very briefly, please.
Oh, no one wants to go first.
And it's certainly something we can also, a question we will open up to the audience
No,
just
I think
now.
it's quite a significant intervention. It's historic. It's the first time you've had a group of African leaders mediating outside of the African continent as a collective in what is in fact a geopolitical conflict now that's drawing in many different actors. So it's very much a historic event. As an academic, for me, it's prime territory for a lot of research and analysis. That's why I'm encouraging master's, PhD students, grab this one, follow it through. And I think it's incumbent upon us as Africans to actually study it, to analyze it, to research it, to engage with our fellow decision makers in DIRCO, in the presidency. And I think look, there's been lots of criticisms, but I think we also have to give credit where credit is due and to say this day lay some foundation for something that will come in the subsequent phases of this process, if it's followed through, obviously. And for me, I think that's a very important thing. Look, I think the challenge also is the optics of Africans mediating in Europe. I think it's a little bit out of the comfort zone for Europeans and North Americans. Let's put that on the table.
Right.
I think that's a very important thing, and I think it's important for for all of us as human beings to actually recognize that we might be able to learn from a continent, in fact, that's had the most devastation in terms of conflicts. in the history of humanity, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah. For me, of course, it's sort of you're against history if you say that a peace mission is not supported. I mean, every bit helps, so to speak. We must be mindful that peace is a process. Any peace, whether it's fact-finding, I think there is enough facts on the ground already, or at least in the public domain, available. I think it was more of a introduction type of visit. For me also is that I'm a little bit jealous of
Cyril Ramaphosa.
No, I'm jealous of African leaders going outside the continent. As important as it is, as I said before, is that it is the continent asserting itself. That for me was a plus. But then also, let's give equal weight, if not more, to the crisis on the continent. I think that will go a long way to get us fully recognized for that. It does not say that we should totally withdraw from the European events. It is historic, it is a first one for the continent, but we must be mindful that there are a lot of work to be done here on the continent before we go outside. Thank you.
Yeah, I think for me the messaging was that Africa is a co-constitutive actor of global politics, in the sense that it's shaping global politics while also being shaped by global politics.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't divorce that from the bigger question of the changes that are happening geopolitically. So a key message for me is that it's opening our eyes to the reality of Africa's place in international relations.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea that we need to move away from the tropes of marginalization of Africa being a peripheral actor, I think that optic for me was what, when you contrast over the decades, that's the messaging for me that was vital, but also the role that it's playing in leveraging its agency, A, but B, its structural power, finding loopholes, finding leverage, the way it can be able to sort of anchor and build from there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you very much. And let's give a hand to our panelists.
Mm-hmm.
You can stay sitting there.